From December the 8th, 1941, until January the 27th, 1945, millions of Jews across Europe were deported to and murdered in 8 different extermination camps. These camps, which were located primarily in Poland, but also in Belarus and Serbia, were Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Mali Trostenitz, Semlin, Sobibor, Treblinka, and of course Auschwitz. Given that the extermination camps were the most crucial aspect in the cog of Hitler's final solution, it seems logical that the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler might have taken the time to ensure that every site was running smoothly, to ensure maximum efficacy. However, during the course of the war, Himmler only made personal visits to half of these facilities, visiting Majdanek, Sobibor and Treblinka once each, and the infamous Auschwitz, the most prolific death camp, twice. One might think that Himmler's double visit to Auschwitz was simply because the camp was the most prolific, and ergo most important, within the sphere of the final solution. And while that assumption is partly correct, the real reasoning for why Himmler visited twice is actually far more complicated. You see, Himmler's close links to Auschwitz started far earlier than his ties to the other extermination camps, with his involvement with Auschwitz originating as early as January 1940. At the time, Himmler was in the process of reassessing his dominance over Nazi Germany's growing concentration camp network, the KZs or KLs. Determined not to allow his SS subordinates to open camps without his permission, Himmler had recently made an example of SS Obergruppenführer Richard Hildebrandt, the Gauleiter of Danzig, West Prussia, who had established his own camp at Stutthof. Irritated by Hildebrandt's decision not to consult him, Himmler reprimanded Hildebrandt, claiming that his actions would detract from Himmler's vision of the SS as a unified organization. Eager to stamp his authority following the incident at Stutthof, Himmler reacted far more aggressively come January 1940, when SS Obergruppenführer Erich von Dembach-Zelewski decided to erect a detention camp in a former artillery barracks near the Polish town of Auschwitz. Utilizing his veto power, Himmler seized control of the property and decided to erect a new concentration camp in its place, following advice from SS Gruppenführer Richard Glücks. At the time, there were no plans in place for Auschwitz to become an extermination camp, given that the final solution, as we now know it, wasn't properly initiated until the summer of 1941. Therefore, the original Auschwitz, or Auschwitz I, was merely designed with the intent of being a concentration camp, or a KL. Once Auschwitz I had been established as a KL, Himmler reassigned the Commandant of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a certain SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf Höss, to be Auschwitz's new commandant. On May the 20th, 1940, Auschwitz received its first batch of prisoners, 30 inmates from Höss's old stomping grounds at Sachsenhausen. For the remainder of 1940, transports of largely Polish prisoners arrived into Auschwitz, giving it a prisoner population of roughly 11,000 by the time of Himmler's first visit, in the March of 1941. In early 1941, before his first visit to Auschwitz, Himmler was contacted by IG Farben, a chemical company that was interested in constructing a large synthetic rubber plant in Auschwitz, hoping to utilize the cheap labor that it would inevitably find among its inmates. Himmler, who was delighted by this proposal, promised IG Farben that their wish would be realized, and that Auschwitz would be greatly expanded as a result, to ensure that IG Farben had as much access to human labor as they needed. Following this promise, Heinrich Himmler made his first visit to Auschwitz on March 1st, 1941, to aid in the design of the camp and to cooperate with IG Farben over the construction of their synthetic rubber factory. During his March 1941 tour, Himmler was shown Auschwitz I, the main camp, and also the potential site for Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, the new site where IG Farben were interested in establishing their synthetic rubber factory. During this preliminary tour, Himmler informed Höss that Auschwitz would now be expected to contain as many as 30,000 inmates, with a rapid expansion of both Auschwitz I, and the plan to erect Monowitz, or Auschwitz III, commencing in April 1941. Both Höss and the Gauleiter of Upper Silesia, Fritz Bracht, objected to such rapid expansion, citing a lack of resources, builders, and time. Himmler, who was irritated by this opposition, succinctly stated to Bracht, Höss, and the other SS subordinates the following at the end of his tour. "Gentlemen, the camp will be expanded. My reasons for it are far more important than your objections." There is also some speculation that Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, was also formulated during Himmler's first tour of Auschwitz. Birkenau, although later transformed into the extermination camp that everyone knows it for today, was initially designed to be a large prisoner of war camp, to help accommodate the thousands of Soviet POWs anticipated to be captured following Operation Barbarossa. Therefore, it is possible that this was foresight on Himmler's part, as Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was initially forecast to commence far earlier than June the 22nd, 1941. Barbarossa was actually delayed, much to Hitler's frustration, due to the strategic necessity to knock both Yugoslavia and Greece out of the war, following Mussolini's bungling invasion of Greece and a recent coup d'etat in Yugoslavia, which had overthrown the pro-Axis government there. Therefore, on April the 6th, 1941, Nazi Germany and its allies invaded Yugoslavia, delaying Operation Barbarossa. But as March the 1st, 1941 was just over a month before the invasion, Himmler might still have been under the illusion that Barbarossa were to be initiated sooner, supporting the idea that he wished to construct a prisoner of war camp at Auschwitz, allowing one to backdate Birkenau's inception to March 1941. However, Lawrence Rees convincingly criticizes theories like this in his book Auschwitz, the Nazis and the Final Solution, where he utilizes newer evidence as a means to attack the March 1941 theory. A document from Auschwitz, backdated to September the 12th, 1941, and titled Explanatory Report regarding the preliminary draft, the construction and expansion of the Auschwitz concentration camp, contains a detailed description of both the present state and future expansion of the Auschwitz camp, boasting a theoretical capacity of up to 30,000 prisoners. But there is no mention anywhere in this document, or in the various attachments, of any camp planned to be built at Birkenau. Therefore, one might assume that even on September the 12th, 1941, no detailed plan yet existed for the construction of Birkenau. In fact, it was likely not until the second week of September 1941 that the plan to construct a new POW camp at Birkenau was finalized. On September the 15th, Himmler discussed the issue of Soviet prisoners of war with Reinhard Heydrich and Oswald Pohl. This was followed by a telephone conversation with Pohl the next day, which, according to a note of Himmler's diary, concerned 100,000 Russians, who were to be taken over by the KZ or KL concentration camp system. On September the 26th, Hans Kammler, head of the Central SS Buildings Office, finally ordered the construction of a new POW camp at Auschwitz. Thus, all of Rees's evidence points to the final decision to construct Birkenau being taken in September 1941, and not March. It remains possible, of course, that Himmler first saw the possibilities of Birkenau when he visited Auschwitz in March 1941. He might even have mentioned to Höss at the time that one day it could be a suitable location for expansion. But, as the new evidence reveals, no concrete decision about Birkenau was officially made until September 1941. On July the 17th, 1942, roughly 15 months after his first visit to Auschwitz, Himmler returned to the death camp for his second and final inspection. In those 15 months, the camp had transformed into the sprawling behemoth that we know today, although, even at this point, Auschwitz was still undergoing major expansion. Following his arrival into Auschwitz I, Himmler was taken to Höss's office, where the Reichsführer SS was shown a map of the camp, with all of its labyrinthic twists and turns. Eager to see his vision realized, Himmler's first stop on the tour was the extermination camp at Auschwitz II, or Birkenau. As the first part of his tour of Auschwitz II, Hess showed Himmler the gypsy camp, when the Commandant complained to the Reichsführer about the staggeringly high rate of child mortality. Although it might seem a little ironic for Hess to care about the mortality rates in an extermination camp, the gypsy camp was considered by the Commandant to be bad optics for Auschwitz, which reflected upon him. Its filthy conditions, rampant mortality rate, and cramped living quarters were the hallmark of incompetence for Hess, which he put down to a lack of funding and a poor selection of staff. Unsurprisingly, Himmler was irritated by yet more whining from his subordinates, and curtly informed Hess of the following, which the Commandant recalled in his autobiography. "I want to hear no more about difficulties. An SS officer does not recognize difficulties. When they arise, his task is to remove them at once by his own efforts. How this is to be done is your worry, and not mine." After scolding Hess, Himmler was then taken to the extermination area, where he witnessed the gassing of a group of Dutch Jews in one of Birkenau's provisional gas chambers, called the Little White House, or Bunker 2. Auschwitz's Little White House had been operational as a gassing facility since the June of 1942, with the original gassing facility, called the Little Red House, or Bunker 1, commencing gassing operations in the March of 1942, in parallel with the opening of the Belzec extermination camp. During the gassing, Hess remarked that Himmler, quote, remained silent, unobtrusively observing the officers that engaged in the proceedings, unquote. Following the gassing, Himmler was then shown the rather fledgling burial process, which was still the protocol at the time in Auschwitz. This is in spite of the fact that Action 1005 had been initiated a month prior, in the June of 1942, but SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel had only experimented with mass body burning techniques at this point in the Chelmno extermination camp. At this point in the July of 1942, Birkenau's infamous crematoria and adjacent gas chamber buildings were yet to be constructed. After the gassing, Hess took Himmler to Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, to show him IG Farben's new synthetic rubber factory. During this tour, Himmler pressed the IG Farben officials on the working conditions and capabilities of its prisoners, urging them to accelerate efficiency. He pushed this, all while informing them their workers would now be receiving even fewer rations than before, due to the issues of feeding all of the occupied territories recently captured in the east. Once he had inspected Monowitz, Himmler, Hess, and the other notable Auschwitz SS attended a dinner on the eve of July the 17th. Before the sit-down meal began, Himmler did a sort of meet and greet with the higher-ranking SS working in and around Auschwitz, talking to his men about their daily routines and their families. During dinner, Himmler sat next to Hess, with the latter pressing Himmler on the issue of incompetence among his SS guards, begging the Reichsführer to supply him with better officers. Himmler, who was well aware that Fall Blau, the German push towards the oil fields in the Caucasus, was in full effect at this point, and he knew the importance of having the more military-minded and fitter young men fighting at the front. After all, a death camp is not a battlefield. As such, he told Hess of the following: "I need every officer, junior officer, and man who is capable of serving on the front line. For the same reasons, it is impossible to increase the strength of the guard. You could use more dogs for this purpose instead. I'll get my expert in dog handling to call on you in a few days and explain the new method of using dogs as substitutes for guards. The number of escapees from Auschwitz is unusually high and unprecedented in a concentration camp. I approve of every means, I repeat, every means being used to prevent these escapes. This escape disease, which has become rampant in Auschwitz, must be eradicated." Although Hess had effectively described Himmler to be a miserable git during his tour of Auschwitz, which makes sense given how horrible Auschwitz was, he apparently lightened up that same evening, and partook in activities he normally wouldn't. According to Hess, Himmler was, quote, in the best of spirits, taking a leading role in the conversation and being extremely amicable, especially towards the ladies. He tried on every possible subject which came up in the conversation. He discussed the education of children, new buildings, books, pictures, and art. He spoke about his experiences with the frontline divisions of the SS, and even his visits to the front with the Führer. Himmler, who was also normally rather po-faced about frivolities and drinking, decided that evening to indulge in a bottle of red wine, even light up a few cigars. As Hess said, quote, "I'd never known him like that before," unquote. Of course, such a reaction makes sense, given that Himmler had just witnessed a tour of Auschwitz. Drinking and smoking would be a welcome distraction, and an easy means to numb oneself after a day of touring a place of such depravity. On day 2, that being the 18th of July 1942, Rees gave Himmler a tour of the women's camp in Auschwitz I, in which he observed the whipping of a non-Jewish female prisoner, a prostitute who had been caught stealing from the camp stores. Even more intriguingly was Himmler's discussion with a small number of non-Jewish female prisoners who had recently been sent to Auschwitz for petty crimes. After speaking to each of them individually, Himmler personally ordered their immediate releases. Later that same morning, the Reichsführer even spent a little bit of time debating some of the female Jehovah's Witnesses in Auschwitz, arguing with them about their beliefs. Once he had finished debating, Himmler held a final conference in Hess's office, where he announced the following: "I have now made a thorough inspection of Auschwitz. I have seen everything, and I have seen enough of the deficiencies and difficulties, and I have certainly heard enough of them from you. I can, however, do nothing to alter them. You will have to manage as best you can. We are now in the middle of a war, and we must learn to think in terms of war. The actions, which I have ordered the security police to carry out, will not be stopped under any circumstances, least of all because of the lack of accommodation and so on, which I have been shown. Eichmann's program will continue to be carried out and will be intensified month by month. You must see to it that swift progress is made with the building of Birkenau. The gypsies are to be destroyed. The Jews who are unfit for work are to be destroyed with the same ruthlessness. Soon the labour camps of the armaments factories will absorb the first large contingents of able-bodied Jews, and that will give you some breathing space once again." Once Himmler had finished, he then personally promoted Rees to the role of Obersturmbannführer, impressed with what he had achieved thus far. After saying his farewells, the Reichsführer SS departed Auschwitz for the final time. He would never return. The date of Himmler's final visit to Auschwitz, on July the 18th, 1942, was roughly 2.5 years before Auschwitz was eventually liberated by the Red Army, on January the 27th, 1945. From the time of Himmler's final visit until the camp's liberation, Auschwitz underwent further developments and transformations, especially in the extermination camp, that being Auschwitz II or Birkenau. Yet, despite these changes, Himmler never returned to Auschwitz to see the final model, as it were. In fact, the next time that the Reichsführer SS would enter the gates of an extermination camp would be during his tour of the Action Reinhard death camps in early 1943. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video to be both informative and interesting. If you'd like to hear more about Himmler's tours of the extermination camps, then make sure to like and subscribe, and turn the notification bell on, to not miss out on the release of part 2 of this mini-series, which will look at Himmler's visits to Sobibor and Treblinka. If you have any other questions, then please let me know in the comments section below. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.